So the last time I was here, I talked about genomes and life sciences, and the obvious transition is to talk about countries. Right. And this book, The Untitled States of America, could be subtitled Dyslexics of the World Unite. The really interesting question about countries is what they are. And assume that you started with a blank slate. So here's your country, and now you're in charge. And you get to do anything you want, because you're the dictator. So let's assume that you control all the media, all the jobs, all the universities, all the kindergartens. Everything that goes in and everything that comes out, all the inputs, all the outputs, you control them. And you do that for 40 years. Well, you'd assume that you'd have a pretty good control over that country, particularly if you were as efficient, say, as the Germans. But the odd thing about this country, the strange thing that is going on in this particular worker's paradise, is that after 40 years of absolute control over this country, after having control over everything that comes in, everything that comes out, you got a little chink in the wall. And that little chink 9 days later led to that country disappearing, which is kind of amazing. I mean, if you think about building countries and how you would want to control them, the fact that a country can disappear in 9 days is pretty stunning. Sometimes tea parties have unintended consequences. Right? Somebody throws a little bit of tea in there and you don't know where you're going to end up. And if you read the McCullough book of 1776, it wasn't the intention of the founding fathers to separate. It wasn't their intention to gain independence. It wasn't their intention to secede. As Washington's running around the country, he was still trying to figure out how to keep it all together. But once these dynamics get started, it's sometimes hard to stop them. So here's part of what the world looks like today. So Europe used to have 1/3 less flags, borders, and anthems a few decades ago. And you've tripled the number of borders on this continent. And that's pretty astonishing. It's not just the Yugoslavias of the world that are breaking up. It's whole continents that are breaking up, and it's happening pretty often. And of course, this is an old story. There's a really neat movie you can get from the internet, from Maps of War. So here is the imperial history. Let's cover 5,000 years in about 90 seconds. This is the history of the Middle East, 3000 BC to 2006. Now, why do you suppose it's so hard to govern these places? Yeah, good luck. the interesting thing about this stuff, as you go forward and you look at countries appearing and disappearing, is how often it happens, how common it is, and how often people take their country for granted. Because they say that happens everywhere else, it doesn't happen here, right? So in Europe today, this little division isn't over. So in northern Italy, you still have the country that wants to become Pandania because they're a little bit tired of being governed by Rome and sending all the money to Sicily. And they've got about 30% of the vote. And if you look at Spain, well, there's a series of very strong regional identities in Spain. Now think about that for 1 second. This is a pretty defined geography. This is one peninsula. It's been speaking Spanish for, at least 500 years. It's been a united kingdom for at least 500 years. It's had one religion for about 500 years. And even within that very defined kingdom, very defined geography, you're still getting Basques and Catalans and Galicians coming out and saying, we want our own autonomy, we want our own country. If that can happen to Spain after 500 years, could it happen anywhere else? Well, that's an interesting question. Are there any examples of regional identity that we could possibly find inside, let's pick a random country, say the US. Well, there are 50 stars, but we're alone. Is this identity reinforced in any way? Well, how about when you drink a beer? And what is the marketing motto for Lone Star Beer? It's the national beer of Texas. And when you go to the money tells you it's the Lone Star State. And then when you go out to the Texas Department of Tourism, what is the motto of the Texas Department of Tourism? Indeed. They like this so much, they put it on their license plates. And by the way, you really have to trust what people put on their license plates. It often tells you a lot about a place. If you go to the state of Connecticut, richest state in the Union, remember what the license plates used to say? It was done by the kids. Preserve the trust. Thank you, Grandpa. This is now getting to the point where you can issue your own currency for your own presidents. And by the way, as of 2 years ago, you have to pledge allegiance to the flag of Texas every morning as well as to the flag of the United States. By law. Curious. So what do you suppose these flags have in common? Turns out Six Flags Over Texas ain't just an amusement park. And it may be that there will never, ever, ever be a different flag from that one that will ever fly over the Texas territory. But so far that has not been the history. So it's really dangerous to take countries or flags or borders or anthems for granted and say, as long as we have an amendment that says you can't burn this, then it'll last forever. Well, that's an interesting way of doing it. Till you get a disabled Special Forces veteran who stands before Congress and says, look, flags don't have rights, people do. And when you give the flags the rights and take them away from the people, then you've made a mistake and you're going to lose that flag. So these are the countries in the world that now have autonomy or secession movements within them. It is actually a very common phenomenon these days. And in fact, we've gone out there and generated a whole series of borders, and by the way, borders are creations of human beings. Borders are not creations that you see from space, even on islands, because you can split islands. Dominican Republic and Haiti, or even the British Isles. We'll talk about that later. So if it turns out that there are no natural borders on this thing, then the logical consequence of this is these things that we hold so dear turn out to be myths. And they're myths generated by human beings, and they last only as long as your kids are willing to believe the same myths. Because the day your kids say, hey, that was great for you, that was great for Grandpa, but I don't believe in this stuff anymore, then that flag goes into an archaeology museum. And a new symbol, a new myth, a new belief system comes into the fore. And that happens to country after country after country. You can take, strong patriotic phrases like this one, and it's amazing how many people actually really truly believe this even today. And not just in the United States. In fact, the Russians agree. And by the way, so do the citizens of Luxembourg. Even the French. And of course the Dutch. So let's get a little more specific. How about this one? Well, again, there's an extraordinary amount of agreement on this particular stuff. The Brits agree. The Cubans agree. The Danes agree. You know what? Even the North Koreans agree. Here's what happens to countries. You get this political system, or you get this economic system, or you get the system of beliefs, religious or whatever, that goes out there and promises you that you are going to have X, Y, or Z because you are a citizen of this workers' paradise or of this particular country, or because you are a member of this particular tribe, you will have the following benefits. The problem is that occasionally those benefits are not quite the reality of what people live. And the broader that gap gets between what people are being promised and told this country stands for and what that country is actually delivering, then you start getting this gap in legitimacy, and that legitimacy gap, if it gets too broad, allows countries to disappear in 9 days. Even if you control all the media, even if you control all the jobs, even if you control all the schools. Once that legitimacy gap gets too large, once there are groups or tribes or autonomous regions inside a country that decide, I don't want to believe the same myth, then countries can fall apart very quickly. Of course, this isn't the first time it's happened. Countries are a new creation. The flags of old used to be your heraldic shields, and you used to give everything for your honor, for your family, for your shield. And of course, the greatest of emperors has also disappeared time and again, even though these folks, of course, never thought it would happen to them. The interesting thing is even the most powerful of gods can disappear. It's not just countries and empires, it's gods themselves. When the gap between what a god promises and what a god delivers gets to be too large, that god goes into an archaeology museum. So if you don't sacrifice 10 virgins tomorrow, the sun will not come up. And the sun comes up a series of times, well, that god and that god's promises become less relevant. And even though there are a whole pile of people running around the world today that think they have the only answer in a Bible that was originally written in English, or whatever other version of a book you want, this is delicate stuff. And it's delicate stuff because when you manipulate stuff and you separate the reality from the promise and it gets too far, then those gods and even gods can disappear. Which takes me back to a wonderful piece of graffiti that was photographed on a Baghdad wall. Dear God, please save us from those who believe in you. Here's the trend line in nation-state creation 1950 through 2006. It is not just the era of decolonization that's generating flags, borders, and anthems. It is a constant system. We are generating about 3.12 new sovereignties per year during the 1990s, and it's happening to rich, it's happening to poor, it's happening in Asia, Africa, Europe, Christian, Buddhist, black, white, you choose. It's happening all over the place. Here's the conclusion. The one exception to this, the one really odd place, is the Americas. The only place where you haven't tripled the number of flags, borders, and anthems in the last 50 years is the Americas. In fact, the last truly new border in the Americas, where you just brought a border out of nothing, was Panama in 1903. Anytime you see a system in science or in any other structure where the whole system's moving this way and then there's a great big outlier that's acting different, that outlier is an interesting place to study. So one option is the Americas is immune. Is that true? Is there something different in the Americas that means that the whole rest of the world can triple its countries and borders and flags and anthems, but it will never happen here? Or are you beginning to get secessionist movements today in Bolivia, with some people wanting to generate the Republic of Santa Cruz? Is the same thing true in Ecuador? Is the same thing true in parts of Chile, parts of Colombia? And as you go through that, could it even happen in Mexico? If you ask the President and the First Lady of Mexico how things are going, well, it depends when you ask. But it turns out that Mexico is 4 entirely different countries. The cuisine of the Mayans has very little to do with the cuisine of the North, and the dress, and the way you talk, and the way you do business. And the Mayans of Chiapas and Oaxaca are completely different from the Mayans of Quintana Roo and Yucatan. And as you look at these countries, it's actually very hard to keep and govern places like this to the point where about 1/5 of Mexico's population, or the equivalent, has walked across the border. And they've settled in the U.S. The darker this is, the more Hispanics there are. Now, remember those old maps? Why do you suppose that Hispanics would choose this particular settlement pattern concentrated in this region and in Florida? There's probably no historical reason for that. Right? There is no evidence that Los Angeles or Colorado or Florida or San Francisco or any of these other places had anything to do with previous settlement patterns. Here's what settlement patterns in LA look like. So 70% of the kids in the LA County School District today are Hispanic. And the most popular single name inside California hospitals today is Jose. And you're getting a very bizarre hybrid. And that will shape what this place will look like 50 years and 100 years out. And some people don't like this. In fact, some people are very unhappy about this. But as we go forward in these very difficult debates, because I'm not arguing that you shouldn't control your border, I'm not arguing that a country doesn't have a right to control the border, I'm not saying this shouldn't be done, I am saying the words that are used today are going to be remembered for a long, long time. And how you treat people today is going to be remembered for a long time. These are stories that pass on for generations. And if you want some pretty quick evidence of that, look at every single license plate in Quebec, where the motto on the license plate is, Je me souviens. I'm doing all right now. I've got my French, I've got my schools, I'm doing just fine economically. But I remember 50 years ago and 100 years ago when I couldn't speak my language, when you beat me for speaking my language in schools, when I couldn't get the jobs, when I couldn't have French radio, when you tried to shut down my religion, and you tried to kick me out. And that took a great country like Canada and brought it within 0.5% of seceding, separating, becoming 2 countries in 1995. And how we run this debate today, and whether we use it with the stridency of a Lou Dobbs or not, is going to be remembered for a long time. And we probably don't want to see license plates in California that say, Yo me acuerdo. Bad idea. But let's come back to the theme of this general flag. Here's a really interesting question for this particular flag. How many stars do you think will be in this flag in 50 years? And why would one even ask that question? I mean, it's always been 50, right? The placement of the stars wasn't even mandated until 1912 with Taft. You put them anywhere you want. For the most part, you win some, but sometimes you lose some. Hasn't just gone in one way. But the interesting thing about this is the trend line. This is a trend line that you will see in very few nations on this planet. See, most countries get smaller after independence. The US and Brazil are 2 of the only countries on this planet that have consistently gotten larger since independence. This is a really unusual trend line. The trend is for countries to get smaller, to separate, to secede. You've got debates going on today in Belgium, Netherlands, France, England, Spain, parts of Germany, parts of Austria. I mean, just it goes on and on, but not here. That's a really interesting trend line. And what this particular photograph implies and means is that there has never been a president of this country buried under the same flag he was born under. Ever. And until a president is born after 1959 and dies, and there are no changes in stars, there will never be a president buried and born under the same flag. People assume continuity where there is none. So here's one option. If you follow the past trend lines, it's easy to see how the country gets bigger. Right? 55, 60, 65 stars, easy. You bring in Puerto Rico, you bring in the Virgin Islands, you bring in Guam, you bring in the Marianas, perhaps a part of Cuba, maybe a part of northern Mexico, maybe Canada splits, maybe it doesn't. I don't think it would surprise any of you if in 50 years the border with Canada was open and you had a common currency and a common customs union and a common labor market. In fact, in 1949, Newfoundland separated from Great Britain and had to make a choice. And it was trying to figure out, do I want to be an independent country? Do I want to stay a part of Britain? Do I want to become a part of the United States? Or do I want to become a part of Canada? And it was actually a very close vote. And there are prime ministers of Canada who still think that parts of Canada will annex to the United States. The colonies did happen to go all the way up there, and Quebec should have been a US colony except that they spoke French and were Catholic. So they weren't allowed in. But then there's another option, which is countries throughout the world also sometimes get smaller. And that is much more common than getting bigger. What could possibly drive less stars in this flag? Well, before you answer that question, think for a minute of what it means to sit in the middle seat right there. This is 10 Downing Street, and if you're sitting in that middle seat today, your name's Tony Blair. And it used to be John Major, it used to be Winston Churchill, it used to be, Robert Cecil, Marquis of Salisbury, Prime Minister of Great Britain, 1902. What is the inventory that Prime Minister Cecil and his cabinet were looking at in 1902 when they sat at this table? Well, here's one of the maps they looked at. The entire world was a highway to get to their empire. Put up a global projection that's simply a highway to get to different parts of your empire. 11 million square miles. The inventory in this place was, we have the best universities, we have the smartest people, we have the best manufacturing, our Navy is second to none, we can project force anywhere in the world, we have the most respect anywhere we can fight 2.5 wars, and we don't even have to tax that much. The question these guys never asked is, what do you suppose that map will look like in 1955? And if they'd asked that question, it's conceivable they could have gotten it slightly wrong. Just a thought. Because 11 million square miles turned into 89,000 square miles. And now even the core of that island is falling apart, to the point where Scotland has the first independent parliament since 1246 and the fastest growing foreign language is Welsh. And remember those pesky Irish that kept doing all that stuff? Well, the pesky Irish have now become richer than the average Brit and have better universities and have better beer. The other thing you've got to look at before you answer the question, how many stars in the flag, is why do you suppose these flags are red, white, and blue and have stars and stripes in them? Because they all could have been US states. In fact, they came very close to being US states. And the flag could already have 55 or 60 stars if these had stayed in. And as you look at this stuff, the real danger of the United States is not from the outside. The real danger of the United States comes from the inside. It's not the Hispanics that are going to determine what happens to the US. It's not the Filipinos. It's not the Russians. What's going to make a difference in the United States is what we do today. Do we have any evidence that this might be happening? If you wander over to 44th Street and 6th today, this is actually now about 89,000. Present value of what has been promised to families in terms of Social Security and Medicare and the rest of this, $473,000 per family in debt. Here's your trend line. You start with Truman, you go through Carter. That's what the national debt looks like. Then you get the fiscal conservatives coming in the era of small government. Here's the bottom line. A tax cut is not a tax cut unless if you and I pay less and our children owe less. Because if you and I pay less and our children owe more, it's simply a deferred loan with a high interest rate. And we're now spending $22,000 federal dollars per person over 65 and $2,200 per person under 16. That's an 11-to-1 ratio in what was as opposed to what's coming. And the gray vote is about to get a lot bigger. So guess what that trend line is going to look like? This is the consequence of this stuff. Oh, by the way, Britain did the same thing. Here's what the high-tech export trend looks like, because high-tech's going to save us, right? Here's what it looks like compared to China. Okay, when Korea has the same number of engineers as does the United States, that's not a good trend line. Here's what divisions between states look like. If you are red, you get more than you pay in taxes. If you are blue, you pay a lot more than you get in taxes. The only neutral place in this is Indiana. Some of these states are paying out $1.76 per buck they get back. Well, often it's the rich who separate first. That's the division with the Catalans and the Basques. And by the way, that was the first part of Yugoslavia to leave. It wasn't the ethnically conflictive part. It was the part that felt, I want to join the EU and the rest of these bums won't be allowed in. Here's what reading patterns look like in the US today. So on Amazon, if you go out and you say, if you bought this, you should buy this. Well, this guy Krebs went out and mapped that stuff. And what ends up happening is those who are liberal end up exchanging an enormous amount of books. Those who are conservative end up exchanging an enormous amount of books. But they never read what the other people read. The only point of contact between liberals and conservatives in terms of Amazon books is Bernard Lewis's What Went Wrong. It may not be good. If this was only happening in books, it wouldn't be a problem, but the political debate has become so polarized that you're listening to cable channels that tell you what you think, you're listening to radio stations that tell you what you think, you're listening to congressmen who tell you what you think, you're listening to a whole series of people that are narrowcast into having what you think, and everybody around you thinks the same way, and then all of a sudden you go, who's this other 50%? Where the hell did they come from? Who are those people who think in such moonbat terms? Right? That's how you divide countries. You end up not having debates. You end up not respecting tolerance. You end up saying, he's from the other side of the aisle and I'm never going to speak to him. And that's just fundamentally wrong. That can divide countries. Right? By the way, this is not just an issue of flags and borders and countries and gods. It's an issue of business as well. Because just as flags and borders and countries can disappear, so too can industries and businesses. If you were in the Fortune 500 in 1935, you could expect to be there for 94 years. If you make it into the Fortune 500 today, you can expect to be there for 14 years. We're seeing an enormous churn in terms of institutions. And in this churn, if I had a long-term takeaway, this being a Chinese restaurant in Geneva, Switzerland, of all places. Don't take your country for granted. Don't assume that because you don't burn a flag, that's going to fix things. Don't assume that you can spend today, and don't assume that you can owe tomorrow, and that there will be no consequences. And for God's sake, quit calling each other names. Let's take all the politicians who want to untie this place by dividing us and stop it. Because that's just wrong. 90% of us are willing to talk to one another even though we don't agree with one another. But there's a 5% over here and there's a 5% over here, and it's not Democrat, it's not Republican. They're fundamentally dividing this country. And if you look at the history of what happens in other countries, you should not take this country for granted. And we've got to stop some of the political debate, some of the financial debate, and fix our education system. If we don't do that, there will not be 50 stars in the flag. Thank you.